Nam is a university student, living alone in a small rented room on the outskirts of the city. The room is quiet, but it has a rather gloomy atmosphere, especially at night. It is located in an area far from the center, where there are not many people passing by, and it is almost completely separated from the outside world. Nam's room is quite simple, with an old wooden bed, a desk piled with books and a laptop, and a small window looking out onto the deserted road. Every evening as darkness falls, the room becomes even quieter, colder, and somewhat eerie. One Friday night, Nam was sitting engrossed in his laptop screen, trying to finish an essay for his final exam. The light from the desk lamp was faint, not enough to chase away the haziness of the darkness. Outside, the wind was blowing strongly, whistling through the gaps in the window, making the space even colder. The clock in the room struck 3 a.m. Nam looked at the wall clock, his eyes feeling heavy from sleepiness. However, he was determined to finish the work so as not to miss the deadline. Suddenly, a sound abruptly broke the silence of the room. The sound of tap, 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 came from the front door like someone was knocking, but the sound was very strange, not like the usual knock. Nam stopped typing and listened carefully. A little bit of confusion passed through his mind, because this area was deserted, and no one would visit at this hour. He thought maybe the wind blowing through the cracks in the door caused the noise, but when he listened again, Nam could clearly feel something unusual in every tap. It wasn't the wind or anything knocking into the door. The knocking was very definite and seemed like it was trying to get attention. Nam stood up from his chair and quietly walked toward the door, trying to find out if anyone was standing outside. He pressed his ear to the door, but outside, there was only an empty, silent space with no other sound. No one answered. Nam was a little suspicious but thought he might have been too tense and imagined the noise. He was about to go back to his desk when he heard the knocking again, this time louder and more forceful. Nam stood frozen, a sense of worry creeping up. The knocking grew clearer and clearer, and Nam could no longer ignore it. The room's usual stillness now felt heavy, and the air seemed to be pressing down with an inexplicable feeling. Each knock was very powerful, as if someone was trying to bang on the door to get in, not just some random sound from the outside or objects colliding with the door. Nam felt a chill run down his spine. This sensation wasn't like any usual fear. It felt as if something invisible was waiting outside, ready to invade Nam's private space. With each continuous knock, Nam could clearly feel his unease grow. Although he heard no response, the knocking continued insistently and regularly. Nam couldn't stand it anymore and decided to open the door to check, even though he still felt scared. The old wooden door creaked unpleasantly as it opened, adding to the rising tension. Nam stuck his head out and looked down the long, dim hallway. At the end of the hallway, the yellowish light of the only overhead lamp in the building flickered, casting a glow that was not enough to create a sense of safety. But the strange thing was, no one was standing there. No one at all, no sign of an unexpected guest. Nam swallowed, a sense of confusion filling his mind. He looked down at the floor where an odd object was waiting, a piece of paper. The paper was crumpled, as if it had been hurriedly thrown down by someone. Nam bent down, feeling even more afraid. On the paper, only 3 words were written in black ink, messy but very clear. "Do not look back." Nam's heart began to race as he looked at those words. The coldness from the surrounding space seemed to seep into him, making him unable to explain the rising fear. These simple words, though not special, carried a threat that was hard to understand. Nam's mind spun with 100 questions, but he dared not answer them. The feeling that something was watching him relentlessly made Nam quickly turn around, close the door tightly and lock it carefully. However, in a moment of unease, he couldn't stop thinking about that piece of paper. When Nam returned to his desk, an unusual feeling struck him. His laptop screen had turned off. He couldn't remember turning it off because he had been working and hadn't moved from his desk. Nam sat down, wondering if he might have accidentally turned it off in his panic, but the unsettling feeling still lingered. He shook his head, trying to push the fear aside and refocus on his essay. However, when he glanced at the screen again, it suddenly lit up without any apparent reason. His eyes widened as he realized something strange. It seemed like the screen had turned off and then back on by itself without any action from him. Nam stood up, panting, beginning to feel an odd presence in the space around him. As he stood frozen, another sound echoed. The knocking sound came again, but this time not from the main door. The knocking came from inside the wardrobe. The knocking was forceful and clear, not the sound of an inanimate object. Nam felt the tension in his body intensify. He looked around the room, wondering if someone was playing a prank on him. But Nam was sure he was alone. No one else was here. He stood up, his limbs trembling, and slowly approached the wardrobe in the corner of the room. The wardrobe was old, its paint faded, with no signs of anything unusual. But as Nam got closer, the door of the wardrobe suddenly creaked open on its own, as if some invisible force was controlling it. Nam froze, his eyes glued to the scene before him. In the darkness of the wardrobe, a pale hand slowly extended. The skin on the hand looked unnatural, as if it belonged to someone who hadn't been cared for in a long time. The fingers were long and white, with wrinkled, cold skin. Nam stood motionless, unable to move, as though some unseen force was holding him in place. From the wardrobe, a soft whisper floated through the air, "Don't look into their eyes, don't turn back." Nam suddenly realized something far more horrifying. The wardrobe was not just an ordinary piece of furniture. It was a gateway to another world, a place with no escape. Nam stood numb in the silent space of the room. The wardrobe door had been open for who knows how long, and the pale hand continued to reach out from the darkness, beckoning him as though it knew that Nam could not resist the curiosity and fear it invoked. Nam wanted to turn and run, but his body was frozen. He couldn't move. The chilling sensation from that hand seemed to seep into his very skin, making his heart race wildly. The whisper came again, soft but clear, as though it were touching every cell in Nam's body, "Don't look into their eyes, don't turn back." The warning felt like a knife slicing through Nam's mind, making him feel as though he had wandered into a world that didn't belong to him. His eyes couldn't tear away from the pale hand stretching out, each finger long and dry, like it had been neglected for ages, like a part of something dead and dark. Nam swallowed, trying to take a step back, but when his gaze accidentally rested on the wardrobe again, a head began to emerge. It was a pale, lifeless head with black, empty eyes. It stared straight at Nam, unblinking, as if it were piercing his mind, invading his every thought, every feeling. Nam wanted to scream, to run away, but his body was paralyzed. The creature's mouth opened, and a dry, hollow laugh filled the room, a sound not of a human but of something soulless. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Nam began to move toward the wardrobe, not because he wanted to, but because something beyond his control was guiding him. His eyes were still locked with the creature's gaze. Meanwhile, the wardrobe door continued to widen, as though it wasn't just a piece of furniture, but a portal to another realm, a place where everything had been torn apart, where evil had consumed everything and all traces of life had been erased. Nam began to feel a burning sensation at the tips of his fingers, as if something were pulling him into that nightmare. Suddenly, a sound came from the laptop screen. Nam spun around, his heart pounding. The laptop screen lit up, and a strange image appeared. It was a video that Nam hadn't recorded, hadn't played. In the video, Nam saw himself standing in front of the wardrobe, his face bathed in dim light, while the creature slowly emerged from the wardrobe, its deep black eyes staring at Nam, as if it knew his every thought. "It's not me," Nam whispered, but the sound came from his own mouth, leaving him unable to distinguish reality from illusion. The wardrobe creaked open again, and another arm appeared, reaching out from the darkness. This wasn't the same hand as before, but another one, grasping at the edge of the wardrobe, with broken shards of wrist bone exposed as if it had been severed. Nam stumbled back in horror, but the wardrobe began to shift toward him, as if an invisible force was pushing him toward it. Just as Nam turned to run, the door to the room slammed shut behind him. He heard a chilling sound from behind him, and then a strange entity appeared in the room. It was a large, shadowy figure, formless, merely a dark silhouette that swiftly moved across the room, leaping through the closed window. Nam felt frozen, his eyes still locked on the glowing laptop, while the image on the screen shifted continuously. He realized that the video was not a normal recording but a living scene, where he himself was being watched by something not human, an invisible force invading his mind and body. Suddenly, a cold, oppressive feeling enveloped the entire room. Nam looked around but saw no one else, only himself. Faint glimmers of light began to appear, like dark clouds swirling around him, gradually engulfing the space. Everything became blurred, as though time had come to a halt. Nam couldn't understand what was happening. In that moment, a dry, chilling voice echoed from the darkness, interspersed with eerie laughter. "You've entered our world. There's no way out now." And then the room began to change. The walls shattered, the light from the desk lamp grew dim and murky. Nam felt as though he was being pulled into an endless abyss, a place with no exit, where only darkness and indescribable fear remained. He began to feel himself being torn apart, consumed by the invisible creatures around him. Nam no longer had a sense of time, no sense of self. All he could feel was that strange presence, the irresistible threat that was swallowing every last shred of light in his life. He felt as though he was sinking into an endless, bottomless pit, unable to escape. The walls around him slowly disappeared, and the dim light from the desk lamp became faint, as though it could no longer illuminate the darkened room. Everything became distorted, as though space and time had been twisted, with no boundary between reality and hallucination. Nam couldn't tell what was the world he once knew and what was the malevolent force that surrounded him. Suddenly he heard a faint dry laugh that echoed from all directions. The surrounding darkness seemed to swirl, taking on monstrous forms. The coldness enveloped him, making every hair on his body stand on end. "Welcome to our world," a voice said, not from a person but from something formless. The voice was filled with malevolence and hostility, as though it had existed here for an eternity. Nam trembled, trying to step back, but his legs no longer obeyed him. An invisible force pulled him forward, toward a massive shadow emerging from the darkness. Nam couldn't tell whether it was a creature or something else, but it was nothing like a human. Its form was blurred, impossible to make out, but he could feel a brutal, unpredictable energy radiating from it. The dim light from the desk lamp seemed to vanish. The room had become a dark, desolate space, where everything seemed to be ripped away from reality. Nam looked up, and in the darkness he saw eyes wide open, staring at him without expression, without emotion. They were like deep, hollow pits, pulling his mind into them as if they wanted to devour all his life and soul. Nam turned to run, but it felt as though each step he took slowed down, as if the space itself was trying to hold him back. Every time he looked back, the shadow drew nearer, and from the darkness, those voices began to rise, hissing in every word, "Don't hide. You can't escape." Nam gasped for breath, feeling as though he had no strength left, as though his body had been drained dry, leaving only a mind filled with panic and fear. He searched desperately for a way out, but all he saw were the black walls closing in around him, like an endless abyss. He stopped and looked up at the wardrobe, the place where it all began. The wardrobe door was still open, and from within a cold wind blew out, as if inviting Nam to step in, even though he knew it was a trap. "You can't escape," the voice echoed again, this time from inside the wardrobe, as though some creature was waiting on the other side. Nam didn't know what to do. He turned back, only to see a large shadow moving closer, its lifeless, unblinking eyes fixed on him. He wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but his throat felt constricted. There was nothing left but the darkness, no longer the world he once knew. Suddenly, in a moment of madness, Nam decided to run into the wardrobe, believing it was the only escape. He didn't know what he would find inside, but the suffocating feeling, the difficulty of breathing, had become too much to bear. As he stepped inside, a cold, icy wind engulfed him. The wardrobe wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was a gateway to another world, a place where strange creatures existed, and the darkness constantly materialized into monstrous forms. Inside the wardrobe, Nam saw blurry images, creatures with deep black eyes, watching him from afar. Suddenly, Nam was pulled into it with a forceful jerk. The space around him began to distort, as if it were trying to drag him into an invisible abyss. He struggled, but his hands felt numb, unable to break free. The creatures in this space began to approach him, step by step, as though they were savoring his fear. Nam couldn't speak, couldn't resist. His eyes widened as he looked at the pale, dark figures surrounding him. One of the creatures stepped forward and gently reached out to touch Nam's face. Suddenly, a bright light flashed, and Nam felt as though he had been thrown into another space, where everything was recreated. But the strange thing. Nam stood in the middle of the room, the faint light from the desk lamp flickering, but the strange feeling made the room even darker and more lifeless. He couldn't explain why it felt like he had fallen into an endless abyss. Everything around him seemed disordered, no longer resembling the world he was familiar with. Outside the window, the darkness grew thicker, without a sound, only an absolute silence enveloping everything. Nam turned to look at the wardrobe where it all began. The door was wide open, revealing a pitch-black void with no signs of life. However, he felt something was waiting for him inside, as if an invisible force was drawing him closer. The chilling sensation on his spine surged again. He couldn't understand why, but just by looking at it, Nam felt as though some unseen power was silently watching him, preparing to devour him entirely. Suddenly, a faint sound came from behind the wardrobe, a weak breath. Nam turned around, his heart pounding as if it would explode. It wasn't the sound of a human, it came from some creature deep within the darkness. He could sense the danger, as if he was standing on the brink of destruction. With panic closing in, Nam could no longer stand still. He rushed to the wardrobe, his trembling hands opening the door. Inside was a hazy space, impossible to distinguish where the air ended and the objects began. The space inside the wardrobe was unlike anywhere Nam had ever known. He stepped inside, and as soon as his feet touched the ground, a cold sensation spread throughout his body. The room suddenly became completely silent, no sound, only a thick, suffocating air that made it hard to breathe. Nam turned to look back, but the wardrobe was no longer the old one he remembered. It had twisted, as though it was being pulled into another dimension. The walls of the room had disappeared, replaced by an endless chasm with dark, floating lines in space like endless tunnels. Suddenly, from the void, a dry, eerie voice echoed. Nam heard whispers as if thousands of souls were chattering in the darkness. The feeling of being surrounded and trapped became more intense. He stood frozen, a sense of helplessness flooding his heart as if there was no escape. "You can't escape," the voice repeated, this time clearer, coming from the direction of the wardrobe. "You will forever be a part of us. You will never escape." Nam turned around, his limbs weakening. It felt as if he was being dragged into an eternal nightmare. The wardrobe was no longer a place for clothes, it was a doorway to another world, a world he couldn't comprehend. Strange images began to appear around him, the darkness thickening. Immediately, a pale hand appeared from within the wardrobe. This hand wasn't that of a normal person, but seemed to belong to a creature that wasn't human, with long bony fingers and skin so pale it was terrifying. The fingers reached out, searching as if wanting to touch Nam. His heart raced, his throat constricted, but he couldn't speak. The hand moved closer, each finger stretching further, and then a pale face slowly emerged from the darkness of the wardrobe. The creature's eyes were deep, empty pits, without light or emotion. It stared at Nam as if wanting to suck the life out of him. "Don't turn back. Don't look back." The voice echoed again, this time from behind the wardrobe, as if the creature was speaking to intimidate Nam. But Nam couldn't resist. He couldn't stop staring into those deep, black eyes. A strange force seemed to pull him in, as if he no longer had the ability to choose. The hand reached even closer, and a mouth slowly opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, as though it wanted to tear Nam's body apart. He felt as though he was about to lose consciousness, as if an invisible force had bound him, making him unable to escape. It was a sensation of having his freedom stripped away, of being trapped in his own world. Suddenly, a loud noise came from below. A roar not from a human but from some gigantic creature. Nam turned to look, and in the darkness, he recognized a large figure slowly appearing. A huge creature with long arms, a pale face and glowing red eyes, staring at him with hostility. Nam had no strength left, no ability to resist. He knew he couldn't escape, and this room was now the prison that would hold his soul forever. The strange wardrobe was no longer just an object. It was the gateway to another dimension, a place where evil and darkness never ceased. And so, Nam was completely consumed by the eerie world of the room, where strange and evil creatures would never release his soul.